Hi everyone, in the last video I set out the context in which we're going to make the transition from the ancient world to the world of late antiquity. So we have this period called late antiquity, which is a period of transition from the ancient world to the medieval world. And this is why we're beginning our class on the Middle Ages by looking at the period called late antiquity. And so we're going to begin the first class by introducing where late antiquity comes from. And so in the last class, I set out what the ancient Mediterranean was like. I explained that if we set this period, if we set the beginning of this course around the year 150 AD, we have a period during which you have Gothic tribes to the north that are increasingly powerful, the new Sassanid Persian dynasty in the east, which is increasingly aggressive, and the Roman Empire, which dominates the Mediterranean. Now, the Roman Empire is funded through taxes that are paid to Rome by the different provinces of the Roman Empire. These taxes are funded by the trade, which is local, local within the provinces themselves, regional across the Mediterranean, and intercontinental reaching as far away as China and Vietnam. The peace and the stability that Rome provides, that the Roman army provides, that the Roman Empire provides, makes this trade possible. The trade increases the wealth of this society. The peace and stability that Rome provides also encourages more people to live in cities. The taxation revenue from trade helps build infrastructure that supports life in cities. The peace and stability of Rome also supports a growing culture of education, especially for the wealthy. In religious terms, traditional pagan sacrifices are a part of public life, but in private, people typically adopt one of a number of different cults. And one of these cults which is emerging at this time, one of these private cults emerging at this time, is the religion of Christianity. This is the situation around the year 150 AD. And this is when we enter the beginnings of the end of ancient history and the beginnings of the period that we call late antiquity. And it begins with the 3rd century crisis. We call it the 3rd century crisis, but it actually begins some years before that with the Antonine Plague. Now, this is your first key term, your first key term of this week. You can see it starts around 165 and 180. We're not entirely sure what the disease was that comprised the Antonine Plague, but it's thought that it was smallpox. And it's thought that this disease comes into the Roman Empire when the Roman army goes on campaign against the Sassanid Persians. And we have this new, more energetic Persian Empire that's trying to move east against the Romans. The Romans go out there to fight against the Persians. They're successful, but the army contracts this disease and comes back to Europe and brings the disease with it. And this disease decimates the population of the Roman Empire. We estimate that as many as 10% of the population of the Roman Empire dies as a result of this disease. And this, of course, leads to an economic decline. Fewer people means less stuff is being produced, which means you have less revenue. It means there's less trade. And so Rome, the Roman Empire, enters a period of economic decline, and especially in the western part of the empire. So the period that is colored in orange in your map is especially depopulated as a result of the Antonine Plague, becomes significantly poorer as a result of this depopulation. We then, roughly around the same time, and slightly connected, but the two probably could have happened independently of one another, we enter a period of political crisis. So we have an economic crisis that's going on, and now we have a political crisis. Remember that Rome was governed by emperors. And what was the function of the emperor? They were seen as the leading citizen, the most virtuous citizen, who could make the governing institutions of the republic, like the Senate, work with the army, the real muscle in the empire. Could make these two bodies work together. But in the 3rd century crisis, starting around 190 but extending for the next 100 years, we enter a period where Roman emperors start to ignore the Senate and they become more like military dictators. So they don't have the authenticity of support from the government, and instead their support just comes from the army. Another consequence of this is that the powerful, wealthy families of the Senate no longer are interested in public service, no longer seek to support the empire in any way. Instead, they're just interested in what they can get out of the society that they're living in. So we see a decline in political participation from the wealthiest in society. We see emperors now become only military rulers rather than combining military and political power. Now, if the emperor's only legitimacy comes from the army, that means it's crucial for them to keep the army on their side. And so that means they have to keep raising the wages of the army. But this isn't a paper currency like we have today, where you can just print more money at the drop of a hat. This means that in order to provide money to continue to raise the wages of the soldiers, continue to keep them happy with the emperors, this means that the amount of precious metal in the currency has to be reduced. And so those of you who were with me last semester will have seen how the amount of silver in a basic Roman coin dramatically decreases during this period. And so this means that money is increasingly worthless. This in turn means that the government is poor and that the currency has been inflated. So even though the military is receiving higher and higher wages, the money is not buying anything or it's buying less and less because everyone knows that it's worth less. And this meant not entirely worthless, but worth less than it had been before. So this means that the army is increasingly restless, and the solution to the problems is just to replace these emperors. And so we enter a period of constant military coups. This chart at the top here gives you a sense that it shows you how many emperors the Romans had during these different periods. And you can see during the period that we're entering, 200 to 250, 250 to 300, a huge increase in the turnover of emperors. As the military becomes dissatisfied, they can't buy anything with their worthless salaries, and so they overthrow the emperors. They bring in a new emperor who promises to give them more money and devalues the currency, and the vicious cycle continues. And so we have constant military coups, constant political turnover, at the same time as the Roman Empire is experiencing new political pressure. The Persians, the Sassanids, continue to invade and to attack the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. The first Roman emperor to be killed in battle is killed fighting against the Persians. Another Roman emperor is captured and used by the Persian emperor as his stool for mounting his horse for the rest of his life. This is unthought of humiliations 100 years before. The Goths, their invasions are increasingly effective and increasingly devastating. You can see on this map here, Gothic invasions that are reaching as far south as Spain, that are reaching into Italy. The Romans are now struggling to defend their northern frontier. So this is the crisis of the 3rd century, that you have a population decline, which contributes to an economic decline. This economic decline is worsened by the bad political situation and the devaluation of the currency that leads to further political unrest and uncertainty, at the same time as the empire is increasingly struggling to defend itself against its external aggressors. And it gets to the point where 100 years after the Antonine Plague, around the year 250 or so, the empire is actually splitting apart. And this is also what your map shows you here, that different regions of the empire that are colored in orange, purple, and yellow basically decide to go their separate ways. To the point that by the time we reach the year 250 AD, it seems as though the empire is just going to disintegrate. That it's going to split into these different parts. They're going to continue to struggle to defend themselves against the Goths and the Persians. There's going to be no political stability, and this crisis is just going to continue. I'm going to leave this video here, and we're going to move on to talking about Diocletian and Constantine in the next video.